So I know John Carroll, has famously, challenged, his former paper in Kentucky to sort of correct the record
Hmm.
that they had kind of ignored the civil rights movement while it was going on, and that and so they took him up on that challenge,
Hmm.
decades later, and acknowledged that the coverage had really been wanting, if not non-existent. Did anything similar happen in Arkansas?
I don't. I'm not aware of anything like that. The Arkansas Gazette of that era was I thought quite courageous. If you look back though at the paper and what its stand was in the Little Rock schools, this crisis, it was not for desegregation per se. It was for obeying the law of the land, and we still lost 20% of our circulation in 2 weeks. Uh, Part of it was, I mean, much of it was the tenor of the times, but they were. I don't think that paper would have overlooked something like that. Uh, the one you referred to in Lexington, Kentucky, that the newspaper at the time in the 60s simply did not cover the sit-ins and that desegregated facilities there in Lexington. And so when John made that remark, he was then the editor of the Los Angeles Times. The editors back at Lexington decided they would just do what John said. John said that something like, it has come to the editor's attention that we failed to cover the civil rights movement. We're now redressing that. And they actually did go back and do a historical record of what happened in Lexington in the 60s.
So we can move on to the inquiry. You were there
Yeah.
for quite a long time, and
Hmm.
upper management in the newsroom.
Yes.
What what did you find when you got there?
Hmm.
When you became the managing editor, was there anything about the culture of the place you wanted
Hmm.
to change? And did you start to tighten up the ethics standards? Did they
Yes.
need tightening up?
Yes. Gene Roberts became the executive editor in October of 1972, and I was one of the first people he hired, and I came as managing editor in February of 1973, 4 months later. Gene took the job because it was a challenge. That this was not a very good newspaper, had not been under Walter Annenberg. It was only 2.5 years into the ownership by night newspapers. And so we were dealing with the staff, most of whom we had inherited from the Annenberg era. And Annenberg had gone through several, or at least one major buyout, and so a lot of people who could have got jobs elsewhere took them. And when saying this, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. That there were some very good journalists that we inherited, but by and large, it was not the staff that we wanted to take the Inquirer to the level that we wanted to take it to, and the practices were not well developed, even though our ideas about journalism ethics were still evolving at that point. The Annenberg era, that Walter used the paper as a political weapon against his enemies, and he had several. He would not list their names in the paper. I think the president of the University of Pennsylvania could not have his name listed in the Inquirer, and all the reporters and copy editors knew that his name was not, he would become a spokesman for the University of Pennsylvania if it became necessary to quote him at all. The Philadelphia 76ers, they stopped running during the Annenberg era, stopped running the scores because they didn't like the 76ers or their owner. That's the sort of thing. And I think that they had a political reporter who would go after Walter's enemies. And one of them was Milton Shapp, who later became governor of the state. And the reporter was asked to ask at the press conference, Governor Shapp, have you ever been in a mental institution? And he said no. That was the end of the question and answer. But the headline the next morning on the front page of the Inquirer said, Shapp denies being in mental institution. So that's the sort of thing that highly manipulated. And of course the Joseph Carafin case, Joe Carafin was an investigative reporter during that era. He was exposed by Philadelphia Magazine in the late 60s as having extorted money from people on whom he had dug up dirt. that he would tell them, here's a story that's going to go in the Inquirer, but you can keep it out if you retain me as a public relations specialist for a certain amount of money per month. And after that story came out, Carafin went to prison for extortion. So this is the sort of reputation we were trying to live down, and presented quite a challenge for us. The Inquirer, underneath the nameplate on page 1, said oldest newspaper in America. And critics of the Inquirer would say that it starts with a lie and goes from there. That it was not the oldest newspaper, but that at one point Walter Annenberg had hired a genealogist to trace the history of the paper from its founding in 1829. It was the third oldest paper continuously published since 1829. That's quite a feat in itself, but he made it number 1 because they had over the years bought papers that were started earlier than 1829 and earlier than the Hartford Courant. So the paper started off with a slogan that was false, and it was on the front page every day. So that's what we were dealing with.
So can you think of other ethics issues that came up in the context of covering desegregation in Little Rock?
Well, one incident that came up, and this is toward the end of what I call the crisis in '59, when the moderates, that is white school board members who were willing to accept desegregation in order to keep the schools open and to have and have peace, and winning out over dead-end segregationists who closed the schools in '58, '59, and who were willing to do anything to avoid desegregation. So in the recall election, it was a showdown where all 6 of the board members, 3 moderates and 3 dead-end segregationists, had their tenure challenged, and the public, by a very narrow margin, voted for the moderates to stay in and the dead-end segregationists to be ousted. At that time, all they needed was 1 more member to get a majority. In an act of generosity, they offered the defeated segregationists a chance to, no questions asked, give the appointing person the name of someone to go on the school board, and that person will be a 6th member of the board. He'll be outvoted, or she'll be outvoted 5-1, but will be on the board. The name they gave turned out to be that of a convicted burglar. And of course, our reporters, before the end of the day, were able to establish that he not only was a convicted burglar, but he was ineligible to serve because of this felony. And so the burglar came to see Harry Ashmore and said that it's a deal. I never was appointed. I'm willing to withdraw my name, and you don't need to report tomorrow. And Harry Ashmore quite correctly said that we don't manage the news, we only report the news. And you were appointed, you were found to be ineligible, and you have now withdrawn. We will report all of that. So I thought to myself, I think that's a good decision, but it's the sort of thing that I never studied in college. And because we did not have a course such as we have now in journalism ethics with case studies. And I said, well, maybe there ought to be something that we teach in college, editor's decisions or something like that, the kind of dilemmas, or maybe this wasn't a dilemma, but the kind of difficult decisions you might be presented with as a working journalist. And from all that, though, has evolved, I think, particularly in the last 25 years, the kind of courses we have around the country in universities now.